Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon to everybody who's here in Washington. I understand that there are people joining from around the world, actually. So hello to everybody, and thanks for joining for this session. My name is Wendy Hughes. I'm the Regional Director for Infrastructure for Africa, East and South. And I'm really very delighted to have the chance to join you for this particular session. The topic today is fostering stability and resilience through increased access and mobility. And we have just 1 hour and actually some very interesting panelists and a keynote speaker. So we're going to try to keep things moving at a good pace so we get a chance to hear from everybody on the panel today. I think just maybe a few words from my side. The idea here is to really highlight the role of connectivity and mobility to achieve resilience and stability at the household, community, and national level, particularly in areas that are experiencing or prone to particular risks. So in areas that have conflict or are fragile otherwise, in areas which are experiencing or prone to food security, and of course, overall or underlying a lot of things we have now, the climate change shocks and impact as well. So really, we're going to try and tackle the question of how can we sustainably invest in resilience through transport, connectivity, and services in areas that are either fragile or prone to shocks and conflict. Some of the questions that will kind of be brought out in the discussions. Why? Why should we continue investing in regional integration and rural accessibility in times of crisis? What's the role of different kinds of financing, private sector, public funding, and philanthropy in these particular sorts of contexts? Which actors are best suited to be able to build and also, of course, to operate resilient transport systems in fragile contexts? So these are just some of the topics, but I think underlying it is really a recognition that when we're trying to support or otherwise improve and develop resiliency and stability, quite often you don't hear about transport as the frontline thing to do. But in reality, when you visit some of these situations, or if you're in the government in places which are prone to some of these sorts of shocks, I think it's very clear that for people on the ground, transport and connectivity and mobility are absolutely essential to anything to do with resilience. So I think this is a really important set of topics. It's also probably a sort of angle on the issue that probably doesn't get enough focus. So I'm really glad that this panel will be able to discuss these topics. So I think I'll introduce the panel as we come to the panel session, but we're going to start off with a keynote address from Dr. Christina Barstow of Helvetas, the Director of Strategic Partnerships. And I will actually let you, Christina, introduce your topic, and over to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're actually going to start with a presentation, a recorded video from a colleague in Nepal, Mr. Krishna Kotwal, who's going to tell us a little bit about Trailbridge program there. You could have the screen. There we go. Changed over.
Namaskar and very warm regards to all the distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. This is Krishna Bahadur Kotwal, local bridge section chief within the government of Nepal. I have 30 years of working experience in local infrastructure development sector. I am very much indebted to share the journey of 10,000 trail bridges construction in Nepal. So Nepal has a very rugged terrain with around 6,000 rivers, rivulets that we have to cross every day for seeking various services. And the picture clearly shows that the traditional crossings we used to face and the present day modern technique of trail bridge construction, which has eased river crossing. So Nepal has a very long history of construction of trail bridges. We have started way back in 1960, but we considered 2000 as the milestone where standards, technical guidelines, manuals have been established. And I'd like to appreciate the input of Swiss government through Helvetas for this. In 2009 era, we have also introduced sector-wide approach of trail bridge construction. And then in this duration, we have also constructed around 160 trail bridges with financial support from World Bank. Coming to the present day, Nepal has completed more than 10,000 trail bridges in total, and around 174 trail bridges within the year 2023. So in these both manners, we have established a record number of trail bridge construction. So this has been simply possible because the government has very much dedicated and committed to consider this sector as priority one project and has taken lead with clear demarcation of fund, function, and functionaries within 3 tiers of government. So we can consider that this approach is a decentralized approach of construction where also users committees and users are also mobilized for construction of trail bridges. So simplification of technologies, norms, standards, and standardization with a strategy and tremendous institutional capacity development activities. We have maintained rigorous quality monitoring and information systems so that we have reached 10,000 trail bridges construction. So this figure clearly depicts the condition of trail bridge construction in Nepal. We have constructed around 20 to 25 trail bridges in year 1975 with $800 per meter of construction cost, and reaching present day where we construct around 500 trail bridges per annum with almost per meter cost of $350 to $400. So this approach and the number of trail bridges of 10,000, these are used by around 1 million people every day to commute. And this has saved 2 hours travel journey and also increased the other social indicators as well. So we can consider that trail bridge is nucleus of local governance. To sum up, we can say that Nepal is now fully matured and the government has taken lead in construction of trail bridges by establishing various modalities, norms, standards, and demarcated various attributes of trail bridges to various stakeholders. Likewise, let me state here that we have given tremendous trainings to various stakeholders so that almost 8,000 people are trained and presently working in this sector. So to summarize, we can say that Trailbridge is now built into the fabric of Nepal with high knowledge and awareness within the community. Thank you.
Great. Well, so thank you to Mr. Katwal for giving us that example of institutionalization of rural access. So again, related to these fragile contexts in a place such as Nepal, where they were able to, over many decades, show how government can fully institutionalize trail bridges within that context. So just to kind of zoom out a little bit more, I'm going to share a presentation here. Oops. Apologies. Great. So kind of taking first a step back, I'm going to focus on, again, this rural populations as it relates to this theme of resilience. I'd like to start by just zooming out a bit to the larger global context. So the World Bank's Rural Access Index estimates that a third of the global population, or 1 billion people, are cut off from essential services such as seeking healthcare or attending school for all or maybe part of the year. Much of this is due to climate challenges. These impassable rivers are becoming more and more impassable, or in a lot of remote communities, they are getting cut off due to conflict or other fragile contexts. This is despite the fact that we know when we provide these rural and fragile contexts with access, with mobility, that we see transformative impacts. The examples here are just a few which show that there are proven decreases in under 5 mortality and increases in GDP as we see that rural access increase. Further, we heard this morning that roads precede development, and thus we see how facilitating access to these rural communities has linkages across many of the sustainable development goals, including those related to food security, health, education, and employment. Rural access does not just span the transportation or infrastructure sectors, but is an intersectoral intervention, which is essential to many agriculture, water, and livelihood programs. So in thinking about these challenges and this kind of overall question of how do we drive more resources, this whole conference is about mobilizing finance and resources into the sector, especially in this session related to these rural, fragile contexts. We at Helvetas turned to the success of this Nepal Bridge program, which we just heard about, and leveraged that knowledge, the decades of lived and professional experience of our Nepal experts, to build a competence center known as the South-South Cooperation Unit, or the SSCU. The SSCU is a team of experts from Nepal with decades of this experience, and they provide technical and advisory services such as survey, design, construction, and maintenance of trail bridges, but also the larger systems change advisory services. So think about government engagement, decentralization, simplification, and standardization of technologies, capacity building, and the rigorous monitoring and evaluation systems. Over the past 15 years, the SSCU has applied their expertise in around 10 countries, including Bhutan, Indonesia, Burundi, Honduras, and Guatemala, providing consultative services to governments at the national, regional, and local levels, as well as the African Development Bank and the International Labor Organization. I'll highlight a couple of these engagements in the next slide. So the SSCU is currently providing technical advisory services for a transformative rural access program in rural Ethiopia with our partners Bridges to Prosperity and the Helmsley Charitable Trust, which will result in the construction of over 150 trail bridges across 5 regions. However, the major achievements in this program will come from those systemic changes. So there's going to be hundreds of newly trained designers, engineers, consultants, fabricators, the integration of this trail bridge curriculum into universities and TVET programs, as well as the integration of trail bridge guidelines into Ethiopian standards. With this program design, the SSCU and Helvetas are seeing how this replication of this kind of full systems change model, which we showed in Nepal, can be applied elsewhere. And it's through this use of the sharing of the global South-South experience that we start to see these programs be able to replicate. Expanding from kind of just trail bridges, Helvetas and the SSCU additionally provide rural access services through the construction of labor-intensive rural roads. These roads provide access to remote, landlocked areas by combining the use of very light equipment with employment, local skilled and unskilled labor. Our program in Burkina Faso initially rose about a decade ago out of local populations recognizing this need, and they're wanting for economic development. Since then, the program has built over 1,000 kilometers of rural tracks, connecting over 160 villages. Further, this program employed over 100,000 people, the majority of which were women. But just beyond these outputs, this program did show actual impacts. We did see the time needed for traders to reach market halved, with transportation costs cut by 37%. Availability of agriculture inputs increased, including doubling the use of fertilizers and greater access to agriculture equipment, resulting in an average increase in production of 17%. And then finally, the study found a 50% reduction in the amount of time to reach a health center. So additionally, these kind of other benefits in health, not just economics. So these are just a few highlights of how rural access, how this fragile context can be transformative, and just the mechanisms used to facilitate this. For us, a lot of that speaks to this South-South cooperation and the opportunities that exist in kind of global sharing, and these models that we can replicate in Nepal, Ethiopia, for Burkina Faso to spread it more globally. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christina. I think that was a great sort of scene setting and very forceful reminder of what gap exists for especially rural populations if they don't have what seem even the most basic sorts of rural roads and transport infrastructure. I think the pictures of the bridges and looking at, what was it, 1 million people every day are using these. And imagine if just one of those bridges is missing, what it means for a population who's on the other side of the river or a gorge. I mean, it's really it's very powerful to see that. And I think some of the statistics also that you were sharing, Christina. So let me just quickly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to go one by one, ask each of them a question or two, and maybe look for about 4 or 5 minutes from each, and then perhaps wrap up with one general question to everybody if we have time for that. So on our panelists here, we have Dr. Ralis Koukoulis, who's a partner at Grid Advisors. We have Dr. Barbara Dietrich, also from Helvetas, Director of International Programs. Dr. Dennis Muthike from Verdi, the geospatial scientist at University of Colorado in the research faculty. And Mr. Imtiaz Shah, Additional Chief Secretary from the Planning and Development Department, the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. I'm not sure I got that right, probably not, KPK in Pakistan. Apologies for that. So you can see we've got a nice cross-section of key players in this very important space. I'm actually going to start with Mr. Shah, if that's okay. I think that would be a nice lead-in from the start that we've just had. So just if you can talk for a few minutes to tell us about. I think we've seen a little bit the role of rural roads in the overall development of provinces, but perhaps you could start by just giving us a snapshot of what that looks like in your province. What are the challenges for managing and maintaining these kind of roads? And more generally, so I think those are just always there, but particularly from your perspective, how have you managed to overcome the challenge, especially in the context of the changing climate and the need for resiliency? And I think in your context, I think the flooding has been of a particular concern. So over to you, Mr. Shah. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure to be here amongst you on this very special day and discussing a topic which is, I think, very close to everybody right now. Pakistan, though it's contributing less than 1% to the global warming, but we are the 8th most vulnerable on the planet right now. And we had been experiencing this for the last at least decade or so, because we had a huge floods in 2010, followed by in 2022. There was again, we never thought that in such a small span of almost 1/3 of the country would be inundated. And my friends from Sindh are here. This promise of Sindh, which we had, was under water for good, I think, 4 or 5 weeks, and the water was not receding. And it was something which was very difficult for us to cope with. Having said that, as you rightly mentioned, Wendy, right now, what we need to do is to look into what our rural population will face in case of any other eventuality. Most recently, just 3 weeks back, we had another spell of rain just for 3-4 days, but 40 plus people lost their lives, and most of the parts were cut off from the rest of the main areas. So we all know that in rural areas, in Pakistan especially, where almost 62% of the population is living in the rural areas, and they are dependent in one way or the other to the access to the main, like schools, to the education and the health centers, to the main markets. And if the roads are cut off and if there is no mobility, then these people are very vulnerable to these climate changes. Rural roads, we all know, as we have seen in case of Nepal and in Africa also, the access, when you give people the access to the markets, to their schools, to the health facilities, that actually is kind of saving them their precious time on one side, but making them interact with the journal and other people, which as we are social animals, we need to interact, and we need to access different things that we have with us. Foremost, as we know, rural roads must for the economic development and access to the markets, to the schools, to the hospitals. And naturally, if the roads are there in rural areas, your accessibility time is less. And in our case, if we talk of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we have a very different area. We have mountains in the north. As you come down, we have plain areas also. But all these places, when there's any climatic event, we face these problems that if there's a flash flood in the north and the south, the plain area, because and the roads are inundated, and we need to find out the ways and means how to get those people out and start their life back again. Social development, and if we talk of making too many roads in a way which is not environment friendly, that is also an issue for us. In the northern areas specifically, when we go for the road construction, we have to keep in mind the environmental and the other effects on that also. So this is something which we are facing. This is a challenge for us. We are trying to cope with it. We are trying to make sure that all those new designs, the roads and bridges, which we are trying to get in, we call it the annual development plan in Pakistan. I don't know, you may have been such plans in your countries also. But every year when that plan is made, we make sure that all the roads and the access roads specifically, when we design them, we prioritize them, and we make sure that they are climate resilient now. Now, this is something which we learned in a very hard way. We had loss of lives in 2010 also, and again in 2022, we had these issues with us. Main challenges that we face in rural roads is, again, as I said, geographical and environmental challenges. We have, when we go and start working in specifically my province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we need to ensure that all the roads that we are going to kind of make them accessible to the general public, they should remain open throughout the year, and in case of even any climatical eventuality, they should be accessible to the people. Just to quote a little example, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in our province specifically, the dropout ratio of almost 7 or 10 districts of the girls is, after primary, almost 70-75% girls stop going to the schools. There are 3 main reasons for that. One is because in our area, the culture is like that people don't send their girls to the school if the school doesn't have a boundary wall. Secondly, if there are not enough toilets in the school, they don't go. And the third, the most important, is the access to the school. So if the road is not there, or due to any eventuality, if it's not connecting to the road, they stop sending their, specifically the girls, to the school. So this is one thing which is very close to us in the government also, that we make sure that, because 50% of the population is female, we need to send them into school and make them go there and have an accessibility there. We have financial constraints, of course. Our promise specifically is not as rich as the other three big promises like Sindh or Punjab. We have a locational disadvantage also, and the revenue generation in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is very meager as compared to the other two promises. So we are dependent mostly on the federal government for financial assistance to us. We have technical capacity issues also, but we are trying to cope with it, giving them trainings and making sure that those people and our technical staff is kind of ready to cope with any changes. We have governance challenges. We have issues with coordination between different agencies, because in our case, there are 3-4 different departments which are dealing with the roads. The local government is also doing that. There is a communication and works department that also is engaged in the construction of roads. And then, of course, the irrigation department, even they have the canals and they have the roadside canal roads as well. So they are all used for the accessibility. Sustainability is an issue. We are not that very technically advanced to make sure that all our roads are in a way maintained and maintained in a way that it may remain accessible to everybody. So financial constraints plus sustainability issues, these are the challenges that we are facing right now. You have asked us about 2022 floods. As I mentioned earlier, we weren't expecting that to be so soon after 2010 flooding. So when I just give you a small example. I was talking to another gentleman in the morning also. In 2010, one of our main rivers, which was flooded, which usually carries a capacity of 10 to maximum 20,000 cusics of water in the summers, it swelled to 176,000 cusics in 2010. And we thought that it was a big, huge flood. In 2022, when we measured that, it was 246,000 cusics. And nobody expected that this much water would be coming. So now our main concentration on it is, as you can see the slide in front of you also, we started doing this with the help of the World Bank to make sure that we access in a way that geospatial technologies are needed. And we made sure that to try to open those roads, which were important to us and for the communities that they were connecting the essential services to those people. And again, right now, what we have done in the planning and development department is that we have created a dedicated cell for all the projects which come to us. They go through a strict monitoring of whether they are complying with the environmental standards and they are resilient enough, the designs and the roads and the bridges, everything we try to make sure, because we, again, as I said earlier, we have learned it in a very hard way. So now what we are doing is we are making sure that we, in our design stage, we make sure that all those resilience compliance services are there. Just to take you along, because World Bank is working with us, and we have a rural access road project, which is basically spread over. It was conceived in the aftermath of this flooding that we had. And one of the components, again, I would reiterate that it is to make sure that the children go to the school in case of any eventuality. So that is the prime thing on which this project is based on. They are constructing more than 800-900 kilometers of roads and making sure, as I said, most of the rural and the poor population, specifically in those areas which were merged with this promise of ours, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, by the way, you can call it KP easily. They merged with KP in 2019, almost 5.7 million population. They were merged with our promise. And as I mentioned, that the girl education in those the indicators were not very good, and they're still not. But main thing which we are striving for them is that make sure that those people can access their schools and the health and education facilities for that matter. So we are striving there. We are working for that. We are going to hold a donors conference in third week of April next month, and we are expecting to see most of the people there also. And you are almost welcome to ask us anything if you want. And as I said, this is something which is going to stay now, the climate change. So we are trying to make sure that how to kind of make ourselves adopted to this and start making our lives easier in a way that be very active and be very proactive on that, and make sure that whatever we go ahead and do, we make sure that this climate resilience effect is there, and transportation for that matter, as we said, is the most important to us right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Shah. I think in a few minutes you really managed to hit home on, well, the incredible challenge that you're facing, particularly in Pakistan. But I think also the linkage to education, girls' education, is another one which I think is sometimes realized, but not probably realized enough in the context of needing to have resilient infrastructure. I'm going to go now to Dennis. Actually, I think this is a bit of a segue into something that I hope you will talk about. So I think in the work that you're doing, you've been looking at the impacts of climate change on rural and on isolated rural populations, but maybe more specifically also looking at the geospatial tools and methods and approaches that can be brought to bear. So I think, when listening to the experience in Pakistan, or KPK, let me say, the knowing ahead of time what's coming. The flooding is coming down, so if you have even a little bit of warning, you can start to be prepared. So having that kind of knowledge, being able to have feed the data, or have the data in the first place, be able to feed it into the different agencies who are all going to have to coordinate and be responsible for some aspect, putting it in your planning. I think all aspects of data just can't be sort of overemphasized, and having the tools to gather it and then be able to make it actually useful is really, I think, going to be absolutely essential going forward. So can I pass over to you now, Dennis, and give us a little update from your side on what that looks like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've spent the last 12 years or so working on a global project with NASA and USAID, and I have managed to interact with communities, communities living in mountainous areas, communities living in dryland, more flatter areas, etc. And I've experienced the challenges these communities go through when it comes to coping with climate impacts. When you talk about rural, and you also talk about isolation, those are compounding factors, and it becomes then increasingly important to think about solutions that address the vulnerability of these communities to these factors. I'll give you an example of what we have done. We continue to do in Rwanda, working with the Bridges to Prosperity, who are building similar trail bridges like in Pakistan, to connect these mountainous communities, mostly living in the western regions of the country. And rural development, or basically rural transportation development, there is not that much in terms of how much progress the government and other development partners have managed to achieve. And so a good proportion of these communities have to still travel longer distances to access services. It's school-going children, accessing schools. It's pregnant mothers accessing hospitals, but it's also the farmers, rural farmers accessing markets for their products, and also for farm input. And so what the bridges there are doing is to connect these communities. And one significant impact that we have seen from our pilots so far is the reduction in travel time for these communities to the different service centers. And we are working with USAID through an impact evaluation funded program by Development Innovation Ventures to understand more comprehensively the impact of these trail bridges on these communities. And we're looking at several outcomes, or we regard as resilience outcomes. And impact evaluations are expensive. And impact evaluation, for you to understand the impact of an intervention, you really need to collect data, and often what we rely on are randomized control trials or experimental methods that are very expensive to implement. And when you think about fragile contexts, and when you think about especially low income settings, there isn't that much funding for these kind of assessments. And so you have to think about how you can collect as much data as well, still to give you a credible kind of evidence of the impact of an intervention. And so what we do then in such cases, is to develop alternative methods to which we can collect data that can kind of take us more towards the direction of the same outcome of understanding the impact of interventions. And that's where geospatial data is very crucial. It becomes sometimes, in cases where you do not have the kind of budget of funding to support impact evaluations, it becomes like the go-to. And what we're doing is to use Rwanda as a case study because we are collecting high resolution household level. We are surveying about 16,000 households. We have this year is our 5th round. It takes about 9 months to complete one round. And what we're doing is now to collect that wealth of data from Rwanda. We developed geospatial models using combination of satellite data, combination of computer models, and we develop models that can help us contextualize the situation in Rwanda, but then models that are generalizable to other contexts where we would not have the same kind of funding. We're thinking about these extensions in place like Ethiopia. With the conflict there, it's very difficult to access households to collect this kind of data. And so these alternative methods become then the go-to in terms of us understanding the impact of the transportation infrastructure development on the populations there. When also you think about assessing climate in itself, what are the impacts or the trend, even just basically the trends in rainfall temperatures, etc. We can't put an instrument every 1 kilometer of space. And even in places where we can do that, sometimes we're prevented because we can't access those places. I work with a private company here called Varedi as a geospatial scientist there, and we use sensors to collect data from some of these remote areas. We cannot know what is happening with our sensors in Ethiopia because, since the civil unrest there, it becomes very difficult to go there, but our sensors still continue to send some data. So in this context then, you think about alternative sources, satellites become very, very, very important and critical in us understanding and continuing to contextualize what is happening in these areas that we cannot reach. And in some way, because more satellites are becoming available to civil applications, these in many ways help us still implement interventions in these fragile contexts, but also they help us kind of develop, models, train models that then we can use to transfer those models in places where we cannot reach to get ground data. And that's basically what we're trying to do in Rwanda, and we are hoping that we can extend this kind of research and work implementation across everywhere else where we have similar interventions. Well, we're talking about transportation infrastructure here, but this is also applicable in so many other ways. If we want to understand, for instance, whether there's an impact between the bridges, between the bridges and productivity, land productivity, we can use satellite. What we are doing is actually we're using satellite data and models to characterize, area and a crop, and then we are associating that to yields. And then, we develop these models that we can use them to predict before and after intervention. And we can apply these similar approaches in many other contexts and many other places. Thank you.
I think Yep. It's really exciting to see that. I can see from a research point of view, it's a super set of tools, but also for for policymakers who are trying to design the interventions, being able to have some sort of upfront good guess, let's say, and then over time a reinforcements or an indication of where to adjust, I think is so critical. Also from the perspective of making the case for funding. Everybody, if you have this kind of conversation, yes, you can see these things are important, but how important and what is actually going to be the return, which is often some of the stuff that feeds into decisions when governments and finances have to make a choice, this or that. This to be able to have the information to show really how incredibly critical it is, I think will be is going to be super important. So that was very encouraging to see that. I think especially in vulnerable areas or difficult to reach areas for one way or another, having this ability to get at least a good cut and then maybe update it over time once you can get on the ground data as sort of verification also, I think will be super interesting, super useful. Maybe kind of working my way, continuing this way. So Barbara, maybe going to you now. What are the key lessons that you can share from Helvetas, their rural electrification programs, in terms of scaling resilient transport, especially in fragile contexts or FCV contexts? And do you see any sort of mechanisms that could be used to really facilitate exchange across countries for some of these? Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, exactly. If we look into contexts which are highly fragile because they're affected by conflict or climate change, like, for example, in the Sahel, like in Burkina Faso, like Christina presented our rural access program, it's an approach for labor-intensive roads. So it's the people themselves who work on the roads. And I think it's important in these contexts that we really remain engaged, that we mobilize finance together with your impact research, that we show it has an impact. These kinds of methodologies, the building roads, building rural roads, building trail bridges, and to show the people, yes, we are there. They are not left behind, because being left behind or having the feeling or actually being left behind can cause a lot of resentments and can fuel conflict even more. I mean, that's also what you try to get all the way to the remote villages, areas, valleys, and we have to do this all together. So for our roads, we make one quarter, 25% of the funds go back to the people. So up to now, in the last 20 years, now in Burkina Faso, a little bit in Mali, we made 1,000 kilometers of roads, rural roads, and 1/4 of the whole funding went back to the people. And with this money, with this salary or incentive or at the end it's cash for work, they invest, especially the women. It's more than 60% women who work on the roads. They invest, be it in school fees, be it in small businesses, be it in agricultural production. So they gain something. It's putting cash back to the people. So we said before that roads precede development. I would even say with our approach, development and roads come together. So with the cash injection. And it's also towards climate change. I'm sure you all know the green roads, and it's really what we do. We reforest. We on the roadsides we create basins for water collection. Water runoff is well managed and leads then also into vegetable farming and so on. And again, to come back to conflict affected areas, fragile contexts. What we also try with the people working on the roads, we engage and also train men and women. And we all know that if young men have something to do and have a future, a perspective, it prevents or it helps not to fuel conflict more. So it gives jobs, it gives skills and everything. I think it's a key factor. And the other thing is the access. We all heard that, access to school, but it's also access to secondary school, higher education, access to urban or semi-urban areas, young people being able to get there to try to find an income. And also in the Sahel region, I have to say, in Burkina Faso, I think it's very important also having access to neighboring countries all around, getting this exchange. And not only what you maybe see on social media, see it with your own eyes, see the world, see more. And I think rural access roads have contribute to that for men and women. And then last but not least, what we also try, we have in the Sahel region many IDPs and also refugee communities. So we try really to have them both engaged in the road construction, both get an opportunity for cash for work. So they work together, also different ethnic groups, different communities, IDP, refugees, all together. And it creates a community, it creates a dialogue, which I think contributes to a more peaceful coexistence. So altogether, that's sort of, what I think our contribution is towards.
No, thanks very much. I think it also, thank you, really brings out another aspect which is really critical. One is the roads or the bridges, transport infrastructure to be able to reach essential services. The other is the employment and income generation and the development that happens around it, which, as you say, in a fragile sort of environment, whether it's from climate or from conflict, making sure and finding ways so that people who are in that environment feel like they have a way forward, an alternative to some of the things which end up leading to more violence or more conflict, I think is really, it's not only around construction of transport infrastructure, but there's a huge possibility for the transport infrastructure to be able to provide that additional, not really side benefit, but major benefit. So I think looking at that package, I think is also really, really critical as well. So coming now to Relis, I think we've had a very good sense of, what the challenges, what the benefits are, both in terms of being able to access services and being able to, build some development into the community. But then it all comes down to how do you finance it? If you could talk a little bit about the role of the different kinds of private financing, public financing, philanthropy in this sort of connectivity part. I think we've been focusing very much on rural transport and infrastructure and services. I'm not sure if you also want to be able to talk a little bit about regional integration. I think that came up as well. Can you actually connect with other countries or other regions within your country? If you could just kind of give us a little bit of a perspective on that, that would be very interesting. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, everyone, for your valuable comments so far. It is, I'm afraid, quite stereotypical to repeat that in all this endeavor, the public and the private sector have to go hand in hand. So the way we put it in, for instance, when we have a private-public partnership, we say that it takes two to tango. But then we realize that this is true provided both parties have taken tango lessons. That means they know how to cooperate and how to do this together. And we've been hearing since this very early morning sessions all this debate about where do we find the money. It all comes to where we find the money. We have the public sector on the one hand looking for the money and asking for the money to come, for the funds to come from the World Bank or the DFIs, And we also heard the private sector stakeholders reiterating that there are funds out there, but what we are lacking is the way to mobilize these funds. So although there is a will, we should focus on the way. If we want the private sector to be part of the game, we have to realize that the private sector is a for-profit sector, right? It's not an NGO. So they need to be able to see the profit. What we say is that there is a way to make this profit visible, to calculate this profit for everyone, not only for the communities, for the end beneficiaries, but also for the investors. So what I would suggest is focus on the monetization of all these benefits that we've been discussing. Focus on the monetization of the benefit of investing in resilience for all the various actors. So what needs to be done is be able to perform what we say, what we call a value chain analysis. A road or a transportation infrastructure or logistic services, because it's not just the road, right? It's also what is using this road. All this is not there to serve the community in general. It is there to serve specific commercial activities. And I'm now looking at the photograph that the panelists were discussing this morning. All these activities that are shown here are being benefited from the investments on the transportation infrastructure. So where does the money come from? The money will come from a combination of public and private initiatives. How do we mobilize more private money? Do you know, you are aware already that most of the sustainability and resilience funding currently comes from MDBs and DFIs. Although there are all these instruments available out there by the private sector. What I would argue to say, what I would dare actually say, is that instead of perhaps focusing on direct investments by the DFIs or by the public sector, we should perhaps revisit the role of institutions like the DFIs as enablers of private sector participation. Private sector is risk averse. So we need to make sure that we are able to mobilize risk transfer instruments, like insurance, for instance. We often discuss the unavailability of insurance, the lack of, it's called insurability. What the insurers usually argue is that everything is insurable as long as the premiums are affordable. So we are now discussing the affordability of premiums. And perhaps this is a very good entry point for institutions like the DFIs to perhaps, instead of directly investing in the infrastructure, perhaps subsidizing premiums and paving the way for the private sector to enter the market. And it's also a great role for philanthropic organizations. And we have been hearing a lot of fantastic examples by Helvetas in this panel. So investing in human capital is crucial. We build the road, we build the new infrastructure, but then we need people who are trained on how to operate it, how to benefit from all these investments, how to optimize, so to say, these investments. Just an example from a very recent project we had in the Sahel, where there had been a discussion about, investing in rural connectivity around the Lake Chad, and it was obviously quite hard to identify why maybe invest in a region dominated by FCV, a region where there is all these climate risks, a region where perhaps the Lake Chad itself is reducing in volume. And the answer is that we need to identify that all this infrastructure is not just serving one value chain. So for instance, we can have some cold chain infrastructure to support fisheries, but realizing that fish catches are projected to reduce in the longer term, perhaps we should also check what is happening with the livestock breeding, which is very active and in very high volumes in Chad, for instance, and which is currently just traded as, cattle are traded. So why not invest at the same time in slaughterhouses or in dairy processing facilities? That means that the cold chain logistics would be able to serve two value chains. So the trucks, perhaps transferring fish from the south to the north, could then be used to transfer meat from the north to the south, or spirulina or other value-add products that are there. And this is a great opportunity for philanthropy to enter and make sure they mobilize the human capital so that in total, we increase the benefit of these investments. So instead of just focusing on the cost part, trying to reduce the cost part or finding who will cover the cost part, let's make sure that we increase the benefit and we make the whole thing more attractive to the private sector.
I think that's it's a really interesting framework, the different roles of the different pieces of financing puzzle. I just wanted to see if maybe just probe a little bit more. Let's, with the philanthropy playing their role and the MDBs either coming in maybe with the insurance, what is the model for a private sector to get a return on their investment? Are you looking at tolling models? Are you looking at output-based sort of payments? What's that last piece of the puzzle look like? Thank you.
So in the context of FCV-dominated countries like these, toll models would not work. So yes, some availability payments, if we're talking about concessions, could work. But the whole idea here is to attract entrepreneurship into the actual market. So we don't need, and there were some examples given this morning in the discussion. We do not expect the private sector to just be paid for what they are doing. We expect the investment to be to catalyze more economic activity, and through that generate higher growth. And through the growth, we can perhaps fund or partially finance the investment. That's the short answer.
And unfortunately, we only have time for the short answer, but I think that's really a great taster. I can see we've now got a little bit less than 5 minutes. So I want to maybe just go one by one to each of the panelists and see if there's one last thing or one last point or one sum up point that you would like to make. So approximately a minute each. Perhaps, Imtiaz, can I pass over to you and we'll work our way down this way. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. You see, all this discussion is for making the rural areas accessible and making those people less vulnerable to what they are right now. Points were by Rallis, like getting in the private sector into it. Yes, this is one very good solution that we can have. But what I said was that in the area which we work, we find this difficult because the private sector naturally would go for profits, as rightly mentioned. So you need to have some sort of support to make sure that actually the roads start coming up in those places. And as one of the panelists also mentioned, that this is something lead which we have to take to make sure that people having access to the markets and making sure that their livelihood is generated in one way or other. Other things will complement with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis.
Yeah, I think the point that I want the audience to take from here is that data is becoming an even more precious commodity in many contexts. But it is also, there is a risk there to misuse data. And the motivation should be in utilizing data in innovative ways through which we can really understand what's happening in areas that we cannot access as much data. If, for instance, satellite observations weren't available, and being responsible with whatever insights we derive from that data, having that openness, having the transparency and the honesty. And so for the topic of today, thinking about the usefulness of these satellite observations or computer models to help us target, anticipate risks, and also predict areas where we need certain interventions, and also kind of prospect what the impact would be, both positive and negative impacts, and then constructing our interventions around those possible outcomes. Thank you very much.
A great point. Barbara?
For me, I really think it's important that we don't shy away from really also enabling those who are most affected by climate change, those who live in conflict areas, that these people also have access to transportation. I think that's really key. And however we get there, with the private sector, with some smart ways you mentioned, and also with governments, of course, they are key. And with data showing the impact, I think we should really try all together and not just take the easy way, the easy road.
Yeah, taking it from where Barbara left it, yes, there is a return on investments in resilience. And all these losses that all these people, any nation or any group of people that is exposed to climate risks or any type of hazard is experiencing losses. These are actual losses. And if we invest in the proper way, either through smart or less smart solutions, we should always be able to calculate the return, because there is a return. This loss avoidance is actually a return on investments.
I think that's a really great way to wrap it up. Thank you so much. And thank you also to Christina for the introduction keynote. Very much appreciated panel, and thanks to the audience as well. Thank you.